welcome everyone to another event hosted by the Plurilingual Lab Speaker Series, as well as McGill DISE Research Talks and the Belonging, Identity, Language, and Diversity Research Group. I'm Alexa Huja, PhD candidate here at McGill, and on behalf of all of the team, welcome everyone, and we're very happy to have all of you here today, especially because we are very lucky and grateful to have with us today Dr. Enrica Piccardo from the University of Toronto, as well as Université Grenoble-Alpes France, who will deliver a talk today entitled The Role of Mediation for Plurilingualism in Language Education. So in this talk, Dr. Piccardo will demonstrate the centrality of mediation for the co-construction of linguistic knowledge, as well as its importance and relevance for the development of plurilingualism. So today, Dr. Piccardo will have 1 hour for her talk, which will be followed by a 30-minute discussion period. Here are a few words on our Zoom etiquette to consider. So please, during the talk, keep your video and your sound off. However, you can always use the thumbs up and the hands clapping features. And as I said, the talk will be recorded and available in the Plurilingual Lab YouTube channel a few hours after the talk or in a couple of days. Now, after the talk, we will have a 30-minute discussion period that will not be video recorded. So you can feel comfortable posting your questions in the chat, or you can unmute your microphone and ask a question live. And so that part of the event, the discussion period, will be moderated by my wonderful colleagues, Paul and Ben. And that's it, if I'm not forgetting anything. So I will now stop sharing my screen so that Dr. Piccardo can start sharing hers.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me share the screen first. Right, and go on presenter mode. Right. Okay, thank you very much, Alexa, for this introduction. Thank you, Angelica, for the invitation. Thank you to the entire team of the Plurilingual Lab and McGill University for having been so kind to invite me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. So I will start my talk and the timer. And we will talk, as Alessia said, about the role of mediation for plurilingualism in language education. Sorry. I organized my talk around 4 points, and then, of course, a little conclusions. So first, we will we will introduce the idea of the emergence of a new vision connected with the changes that we are living in. And we will move then to go into more depth of what it means, what all these changes of perspective and the evolution of societies mean in helping us go away from the language myth into precisely the new vision that mediation highlights and help us decode and understand. We will then move to an attempt to operationalize the potential of mediation for the classroom. So the idea is not to remain only on the concepts, but to see how we could try and transform such deep concept as mediation into something that can be used in the class. Once we finish that, we will go and reflect on this big passage from languaging to plurilanguaging. So basically bringing things together to see how mediation is involved in the process of plurilanguaging. And finally, we will have some conclusions. Okay, so, sorry. Let's start with the first. This increase in diversity that we experience in our life is both a challenge and an opportunity for rethinking language education. And I think that pictures are worth 1,000 words, as they say. So I will start with a picture of one street in Toronto, where it's, as you know, is a very multicultural city, and we have several moments like that, where we have English, of course, but we have 5 more languages, 6 more languages here, one next to the other, to express this multiplicity, this multiculturality of the city. But we know that that are not necessarily good. And this is an older picture of when the Berlin Wall was still on, and we have different languages, but we know that this was absolutely not the sign of a positive being together. More recently, I had the chance to take myself this picture in Zurich, another very multilingual and multicultural city. And as you can see from this sign, this is a street food vendor, Middle Eastern street food vendor. And if you read, you have Baba's takeaway, nicht nur takeaway, auch zum Mitnehmen. So here we have already 2 languages, but in reality we have 3, because we have takeaway, which is the British use, and we have also to go. Nicht nur, sorry, yeah, you see it better here. Nicht nur takeaway, auch zum Mitnehmen und to go. And you also have the American variation, to go. So in just this little sign, we have a smooth movement, not only from one language to the other, but from at least 4 different cultures. We have the culture of the vendor, and then we have the culture of the place with the German, which is the language, official language for Zurich, and then we have the other languages. So if we put these 2 pictures together, we inevitably ask ourselves, what is the difference? Well, the difference is precisely that one is multilingualism, languages side by side, addition of elements, and the other is something else, something that different scholars have called with different names, or they have added adjectives to better define multilingualism, or, as with the Council of Europe has been the choice, they have called it using another Latin prefix, pluri, instead of multi, using it as a conceptual springboard to capture this idea of a network with multiple connections and dynamic interrelationships. The idea is to, I mean, every name is fine. It's not that one name is better than the other, but with one single name and 2 different prefixes, the idea is to capture these 2 extremes. On one side, multiplying singularities, adding elements like numbers in a multiplication or people in a multitude. And in the other one is the idea of building on this diversity, building on plurality, and considering the embedded differences in a more holistic way. So to go with some definitions that we need always at the beginning of a talk, we define plurilingualism with the new CFR as the dynamic and developing linguistic repertoire of an individual user learner. But we remember that there is a plurilingual competence behind, which has been defined as the ability to use a plural repertoire of linguistic and cultural resources to meet communication needs or interact with people from other background and contexts, and enrich that repertoire while doing so. So since the beginning, this idea was of a work in progress. A plurilingual competence is something that continues to develop and change. if we are with this idea of plurality, diversity, and hybridity as the new norm, this idea calls for new concepts, calls for concepts that enable us to have a new reflection, a new epistemological reflection. So certainly plurilingualism, or any other term in the area, is an important one, but pedagogically, as we will see, this orientation to action is related to that. But the core concept that can help us cast a light on this plurality, diversity, and hybridity, and how we can cope with that, is the concept of mediation. We certainly didn't invent the concept of mediation with the new CFR, nor even with the first one. Mediation has been around for centuries, and it is Lenoir called the notion, is a nomadic notion. And in fact, it has been used in many, many fields of research and life and study, from diplomacy to conflict resolution and commercial, when there is arbitration, guidance, and counseling, to philosophy, when we have the core reflection of Hegel that talks about mediation when he refers to the abstract operation through which knowledge is acquired. And then there is a second big reflection when Marx and Engels talk about the mediation, when they refer to opposite domains and forces in society. And something closer to our field, which is education, is psychology and education together, where this idea that social interaction and mediation play a fundamental role in the development of cognition, which is, well, I put the name of Vygotsky, but it's not just Vygotsky, as we know. In language education, in fact, if we use mediation, we have a key, because it helps us reconceptualize languages as a language, as an activity, first thing first. Then as a dynamic process of shared meaning that creates and transforms itself through interaction of individuals with their environment, and it's emergent, as we will see more in detail later. A complex dynamic system, which, as Larsen Freeman says, is really dynamic and characterized by phenomena of emergency. Then, as a socialization into community of practice, as Cramshaw reminds us. And finally, this process that allows us to overcome the separation between the individuals and the culture and society. So with one term, one concept, we can start opening up a door that helps us see many things behind the language. In fact, mediation acts as a prism, basically a prism that makes visible what is invisible, because we can see that individuals and collective and the social are interdependent. And in fact, as Vygotsky said, the higher mental functions are always mediated by psychological and cultural tools. And one of the main tools of this is language. We can see the dynamic process of meaning making, which is done through languaging, and then more recently talked about plurilanguaging, which is done individually and socially. And we will come back to both of these concepts later in the talk. And then we can see the dimension, the cultural and intercultural dimension, which is always there when we talk about language, that helps us develop this symbolic competence and critical cultural awareness, as it has been defined by different researchers. So to wrap up with this, we can see, I read this citation, that mediation can act as a prism. In the same way that a prism allows them to see the different colors that make up light, mediation allows perception of the different aspects that come into play in the complex undertaking of using and learning languages. Such aspects go from individual and social process of making meaning through the back and forth of negotiating linguistic and cultural spaces in communication and life experiences, to the shaping and developing of individual linguistic repertoires and trajectories. And we will get into more detail on that. So this was my introduction to where we stand, and let's go into more depth on what implies this change of perspective and evolution of societies that we are in. If we look at the changes over the years, we have seen that this increasing social mobility and linguistic and cultural diversity has triggered a big debate at all levels: political, sociological, cultural, linguistic. And we have some different, and I chose, of course, some key points that can help us reflect on that. Bauman offers us the metaphor of liquid modernity that has been used, but it's really a key, a starting point to rethink the way we live in this world, and we can conceptualize the idea of a lack of barriers in our postmodern societies. He prefers liquid societies rather than postmodern, precisely to stress this lack of barriers and also difficulty to provide categories, to put the things into certain categories. It's a metaphor that the Bauman offers us. Instead of using postmodern society, he says that our societies are so open. There is the possibility of changing and flowing what somebody criticizes as the globalization. And Bauman is also critical of several aspects of globalization because of this difficulty in categorizing and putting things in clear categories and clear boundaries. At the same time, is critic with something, but it sees also the potential of that. In cultural study, in language and cultural studies, we talk of flows of lingua cultures across national boundaries, which again has positive aspects and has also challenges. The OECD talks of a highly dynamic social tapestry, and the third gives us this idea that our society are deterritorialized and then reterritorialized. So the old maps make sense just to a certain point because people are moving and the cultures are different. And we can use the immigrants' languages and cultures as catalyzers for change. In fact, so this is the panorama we are in. If we go into more depth with the language, we can see that language is cognitively developed and socially constructed. And this is, in research, is basically something that has been in the last years and couple of decades really comes out very, very openly and very strongly. This idea that from the psychocognitive perspective, that individuals with more than one language are not the same as individuals with one language only, and because our brain there is a neuroplasticity and we are changing. So the fact that we have different languages makes a difference. The sociocultural perspective stresses the idea that we acquire language as a situated practice, and we have an active role to play in tasks together and alone. And these tasks are constantly shaped and reshaped. So as Landhoff reminds us, language acquisition is the result of a mediation process. And from the pedagogical perspective, we've seen a flourishing of the idea of using multiple languages in the class and teaching increasingly towards language awareness rather than teaching towards one single language in a more critical way. We have seen pluralistic approaches, intercomprehension, two-way immersion, different translanguaging pedagogies, and different plurilingual pedagogies. So we are at the point where we have to think that in real life, we are always between individual and social, and because learners and users draw on all their resources and tools to make meaning in a language and across and through languages in order to access concepts, messages, and cultures, but they are not alone in doing that. They always do it in a double perspective, individual and social, to work together. So in doing that, they involve all these aspects: cognition, emotions, and relation. So we can certainly say that when it comes to language, what we see, both at the level of languages with a capital L, let's say, what we call languages, and what speakers speak, we see just the tip of the iceberg, because language use, which is the tip of the iceberg, rely on a very interesting phase, the in-between, the fact that language is an emergent phenomenon. And it's an emergent phenomenon both at individual level, when the learner learns a language, this emergent phenomenon creates little by little, but also in the society, languages change, because we see that English spoken today is no longer English spoken by Jane Austen, or even just 20 years ago, and with English, every other language. Because underneath, in the iceberg, deep in the iceberg, we have a lot of aspects. We have the linguistic cultural trajectories, socialization into communities, intercultural experiences, the agency of each individual. We have a plurilingualism. We have this co-construction of meaning through these languaging and plurilanguaging processes. In fact, I like this citation by colleagues, Fusaroli and colleagues, who say that language is something that we do, and we do it together. Language, even when written, is first and foremost a dialogical and intersubjective activity. Language is an activity that allows us to coordinate actions, perceptions and attitudes, share experiences and plans, and to construct and maintain complex social relations on different time scales. So this is, I think this is a core reflection on this new vision of language as an activity. In fact, as we said, the language emerges from this complex web of actions. And because it emerges and it's not a neat process, no emergent process is a neat one, but that's their beauty, it all requires some form of mediation. So mediation, we can say, is at the center of understanding, thinking, meaning making, collaborating, in a word, of what a social agent do when they act. So language is an activity, is what individuals who are social agents do. With the embracing this new vision, we move from the language myth, that when Harry said that it was seen, a language is seen as a fixed code, as an inventory of determinately identifiable linguistic units, each of which correlates a form with a meaning or meanings. We move from that view, which is, as he already in 81 said, and more recently has been discussed, a language myth, to this integrational view, where language is a second-order cultural construct, perpetually open-ended and incomplete, arising out of the first-order activity of making and interpreting linguistic science. And this, as we said, is not just done by one individual, but it's the product of a collective mind, of what is called also distributed cognition. So it's done collectively, it's done in this constant mediation process. Once we go away from the linear view, the language myth, we see that language is no longer a collection of interchangeable labels to be applied to objects and concepts, but it's something completely different. And if it is something completely different, the individuals that are involved in this intersubjective activity, complex intersubjective activity, they are in constant need of mediating. And what can we do with that in language education? Well, we can start to seeing language use and language learning as a semiotic nonlinear activity in which precisely mediation is crucial. And the class becomes this space of collective knowledge and collective intelligence and shared understanding, which is the natural setting for mediation. So you see that mediation has quite a lot to say to us if we adopt this new vision. However, is a crucial, as we said, but it's also complex and elusive notion. So what can we do with this difficult notion in classes? How can it be operationalized in the language classroom, and teachers in their everyday doing, how can they be helped to make learners aware of this iceberg, of this complex web of actions from which language emerges, of these social spaces where they are constantly mediating? Well, with the new CFR, we tried to operationalize precisely this potential. It was not an easy task, but I think it is a very interesting one. Moving from the CFR 2001 to the new one, to the CFR 2020, called the companion volume, we see that while the CFR 2001 pioneered a new vision already, and we had already a definition of plurilingual and pluricultural competence, we had the mentioning of a new mode of communication, the big shift away from the 4 skills to 4 modes of communication. It's only with the new one that we broadens the concept of mediation, that the CFR broadened the concept of mediation, that refines this pedagogical vision of the action-oriented approach, which was kind of announced, but in a very shy way, not really developed further, and develops different constructs, among which the concepts of plurilingual, pluricultural, as well as the phonological competence that we want to talk about today. So just to be very clear and very down to earth, what we had before 2001 was the 4 skills, with the idea of a speaker here, and there was this idea of focus on accuracy or fluency, and the idea of mobilizing language that one had learned. With the CFR, we move away from the 4 skills, which are renamed under reception and production, oral and written, but we add 2 more modes, interaction and mediation, and we mobilize the linguistic resources in general, and interaction takes a very big place with the CFR 2001, because the learner is really a participant, but we're still at the social use of language. It's a bit like being in a party with your glass of wine or a drink and doing social use of language. It announced, though, something more interesting. Not that interaction is not interesting. There wouldn't be any mediation if we hadn't had this idea that interaction is different from the sum of reception and production. However, it was not developed, the mediation. It was kind of announced, but absolutely not developed. And it was announced together with an important concept, that of social agent. So with the 2020 CFR, the new vision is developed, because now we focus also on the complexity of the message. We are in the co-construction of meaning with mediation. So mediation has been developed, and we mobilize not only learned language, not even the resources that we have in general, but the plurilingual, pluricultural competencies. So the user learner becomes really a social agent with the new CFR. This was the descriptive scheme of the CFR, and as you see, mediation was announced, was part of the communicative language, the modes of communication and the communicative language activities and strategies. However, it needed to be developed. When you do a project on mediation, you can't imagine how much discussion before getting into the descriptors there is, and how much research in studies, etc. One thing that helped us at the beginning was to kind of do a mind map of things related to mediation. And already from that, which has no ambition to be complete, but just to give you an idea of where we started with textuality, interpersonal, cultural, social, the idea of mediation in the communication flow, in the modality. Like now we are mediating through different digital media, and so it's a different interaction, and also with text. So starting from this big mind map, so kind of sharing ideas and concepts, we little by little developed our conceptual model, where we had clear the fact that there are the two main dimensions, cognitive and relational, that cannot be taken apart, but they are all also inserted in the emotional dimension, because as human beings, we also have that part. And then, as we will see later, there are different, mediation comes into different types of other concept. Okay, this was our mediation, was our conceptual model that helped us when we had to come up with descriptors. However, as you can imagine, that model is still too complicated, too difficult for being operationalized in the class. So we had to boil it down to three main aspects: mediating communication, mediating concept, and mediating a text, plus the strategies related to mediation. All of these three main areas have calibrated and validated descriptors. You may say, well, you just said that categories are not a good thing, and now you go down to three main categories. Yes, that's true. Categories have their intrinsic limitations. So, but somehow they are useful, because it's through categories that sometimes we can bring down to the reality of the class, is something that otherwise would stay a bit in the ivory tower of reflection, scholarly reflection and debate. So we thought that with these three categories, we could capture most of what we have been discussing before. So this idea of creating space, managing tension, etc., which is linked to mediating communication. This idea of going from the social to individual in the co-construction of meaning, and vice versa. And what was more clear already to the teachers, because they had already been doing that for many years, this idea of mediating a text. So switching to oral to written, changing genre, etc. But also this time more with a focus on different languages. These are the title of each scale, and for each scale there are different descriptors that go from an initial level A1 all the way to a proficient level C2. And as you can see, some are very familiar to the teachers, like mediating a text, and some are kind of very new. Not that they were not done in the classes, but they didn't have a name. So sometimes in the work that we do, having somebody that reminds us that, hey, collaborate to construct meaning is an important feature can be very important, or encouraging conceptual talk. You know, there are studies about the over questioning of students. So this is not necessarily encouraging conceptual talk. So the fact that you have descriptors that show that you mediate concept and help you think about that as a teacher and as a learner is important. Just some examples. See, precisely mediating concepts becomes something at the B1 level. So a low intermediate can ask people to elaborate on specific points they made in their initial explanation. Or mediating a text is this move from language A to language B with different forms, and also change of genre, as you can see here in the first, or summarize something for somebody else. Again, we are in a lower level. And it's not only, mediation is not only involving change of language, but often it is. And finally, this idea of mediating communication, where the cultural part and intercultural enters quite a lot, because you mediate in a supportive manner. That rather part, because we didn't want just to focus on those three categories. We mediate across languages and cultures, we mediate across words when we read and discuss literature, and we mediate increasingly online across media. So we had a series of other categories and other scales that are more specific for this type of mediation. And here you have the titles. And as you can see, is something not just analyzing and criticizing literature, but even having a personal response to a creative text, or reading as a leisure activity, or building on pluricultural and plurilingual repertoire. And here are some examples of that. See, for example, again, we are in a B1, can discuss in simple terms the way their own culturally determined action may be perceived differently by people from other cultures, or exploit their little repertoire in different language to cope with an unexpected situation, or in online, engage in exchanges with more participants, or even interact with a group that is working on a project. And we know that we have to do that even if our proficiency is not very high. And finally, this idea of connecting, even in literature, connecting with a character, with your own emotions. So do you remember we had that in our conceptual model, emotion as a kind of overall frame. But as I said, categories are categories and have their limitations. We have to remember that the different aspects of our model are really always there, in different combinations and in different cocktails, in a sense. So for example, you have this idea of relational and cognitive plus linguistic, cultural, and probably emotional in descriptors that have something like highlighting consistencies in thinking and challenge others' idea in the process of trying to reach a consensus. You see, we are at a much higher level here, level C2, collaborating to construct meaning. So we challenge the student to go deeper and try to highlight these inconsistencies and see what that brings. Or at a higher level, but not so high, encourage on one another information and ideas to come up with a conceptual solution. Here you have relational, cognitive, linguistic, cultural, and emotional for sure, etc. I'm not reading them all because I want to have different perspective to show you this kind of overcoming the categories and the limitation. Here, to show you that plurilingual and pluricultural is not just related to the scales that are called building on plurilingual and pluricultural dimension, but it informs the mediation descriptors as well. Here you have overall mediation, for example, can collaborate with people from other backgrounds, showing interest and empathy. And doing what? By asking, formulating, responding, etc. Or the one at the bottom can act effectively as a mediator, helping and maintaining by interpreting different perspectives, managing ambiguity, anticipating misunderstanding, and intervening diplomatically. So, as I said before, things it's not that they are invented, they exist in society, is what we do or we are supposed to do, but they were not visible. In online interaction, is probably easier to see the mediation, the social, cultural, linguistic, and emotional. We know that there are tons of misunderstandings, including cultural ones, when we communicate online. And this is an important point where you can mediate. And in different ways, when you just discuss on when you work on something, on a project. And finally, of course, mediation is at the core of those descriptors for plurilingual and pluricultural competence. So in building on plurilingual repertoire, you have to use different language for a purpose, to facilitate comprehension between different parties. You have to create the condition for using different languages, so you are a role modeling, and you facilitate in your age multilingual context. So you mediate between people in a social context. So mediation is definitely there. I didn't put each descriptors there because it would have been too much, but just to give you a sense that it informs the entire scale. If we remember that these descriptors may serve not as people think just for the elaboration of assessment criteria, not at all. That's the last of the things in the list. They are curriculum targets and they are criteria for selecting and developing learning activities. So this is what I meant when I said they make things visible, because once you have formulated all these aspects, then you create the different learning activities, which in turn facilitate mediation and plurilingualism. So through mediation with the new companion volume, we can do many things. These learner social agents can create plurilingual space, reduce the affective blocks, building bridge, co-constructing new meaning, passing on information, and not only acting as an intermediary or processing and reprocessing an existing text, because this is what mediation was in the CFR 2001. And now all the rest is what it is now. So you see that the concept has been completely redeveloped. And it has been redeveloped because we have moved increasingly from this idea of language to languaging, and now increasingly from languaging to plurilanguaging. So embracing the mediational perspective, she allows us, as we saw, to move from language as an entity to language as a process, as we said before talking about the CFR. Let's try and make the link. And plurilingualism refers to this process of languages across the boundaries of language and language varieties. So it really captures this this process, but it goes beyond, it stresses the idea that we cross boundaries. We are in this liquid idea that Bauman stresses. So in mediation, the social agents are languaging because when they think things through together. They are in mediating communication, they are languages in the process of self-other regulation. And in mediating a text, they are languaging to find the formulation that help them understand the text, both alone or with others. So you see that our three categories that we chose make sense in relation to the languaging process. And in this process, they are involved, all the different dimensions are involved: emotional, cognitive, interpersonal, intrapersonal, cultural, and textual, in different, as I said, combination and different stages. So the new scales combine, support this idea, the pluri scales, and not just the pluri, as we said, the mediation scales, support plurilanguaging. And paraphrasing the definition that Svein gave of languaging, I offered a definition of a dynamic, never-ending process to make, meaning using different linguistic and semiotic resources, and try to chunk it down in what it means if we see this plurilanguaging process from a complex dynamic system perspective. So it's not just plurilingual, it's not just translanguaging, it's not just using different languages in the class, it's much more, it's deeper. So let's see them one by one. A cyclical process of exploring and constructing. Language, as we said, learning a new language is characterized by different phases of emergence. So we are, in a sense, when we learn a language, we are complex adaptive systems that are evolving through different phases of emergence. And individual, in fact, construct their learning in a recursive and complexive way by adapting, by being involved to the language, with the language. And so the process is also cyclical in the sense that it has an alternance of divergent and convergent thinking, because in the divergent, we make hypotheses, make meaning, and then we try and filter and adapt this to what the speech community's norm is. And this is typical of the creative processes, as colleagues who work in creativity have explained. In a plurilingual view, this alternation is, though, not a problem. On the contrary, it's really sought, because the learners are encouraged and supported in this conscious process of divergent thinking and problem finding, not just problem solving. And this is typical of the complexity view that you're not afraid of the chaos of phases of chaos, because you know that this is necessary for the emergence of something new. So you are encouraged as a learner to problem finding, and then you're guided towards awareness of the norm in a convergent thinking process. So you are all the time between the two. And this is something that specific of plurilingualism. It's not just that we invite all the languages in the classes. Sure, that's a positive first step. But then we don't want to create social justice problems just because we ghettoize the people in being allowed to talk in their language, but never confront with what the norm. We unfortunately are beings that are faced with norms, and we have to deal with that. So this constant alternation is a very purposefully sought process that can help really move forward. An agentic process of selecting and organizing or self-organizing. So in the individuals in a complex adaptive system are engaged in a task, and by doing that, they experience different affordances. However, they react only to those affordances that they perceive as invitations. So affordances are around us all the time, but we do not necessarily recognize them. We do not necessarily react to them. So in a plurilanguaging process, these language learners and users exert their agency because they are in quest of those affordances. If they are not afraid of the problem finding, if they are supported in this movement, they go and look for affordances, and probably they see more affordances which are relevant to their learning process. And they draw upon all their linguistic and cultural resources to co-construct the meaning, to mediate, to do that. So the complex adaptive system self-organizes and reaches a new stage in the learning process. And in this plurilingual perspective, the relevant affordances multiplies, not just one language, but there are more stimuli and more languages and more cultures. So there is a need to make targeted decision, and there is an intrinsic uncertainty and elusiveness which requires this focused and lateral attention. And again, we know that this is typical of creating and developing creativity. It's a process of dealing with chaos, because imbalance is key, and the awareness of the complex nature of the language is key. And the individual are able to negotiate in between spaces And there is this notion of the edge of chaos. So they kind of embrace a change, and at the edge of chaos, as scholars in complexity theory explain, it's really there that interesting thing happen. I remember a talk of Larsen Freeman where she explained exactly this idea of the edge of chaos. And of course, it's in her publications as well, as we will see later. Dealing with chaos as a natural positive state, they feel free to make this personal and creative use of all their linguistic cultural resources. Again, not just the cultural resources are there and are available. Sure, that's the first step, but then you use them personally and creatively, and you use your agency. And we know that from research that individuals with multiple languages have a tendency to have a higher degree of tolerance of ambiguity. And again, this is important for creativity. The routine ambiguity in the use of multiple languages, let's remember that the same idea may take different nuances, different meanings in different language. This can enhance divergent thinking. So we have this exposure, but we need the selective engagement with the rich landscape of affordances. And this selective engagement requires awareness. And it's only this awareness which initiates the change in the complex adaptive system and triggers further awareness. We know from study that the mere exposure to cultural and linguistic difference is not per se something that stimulates creativity. Is not enough. We needed to have this metalinguistic and metacultural ability, and this idea of plurilanguaging is precisely focused on this aspect, metalinguistic and metacultural ability. So the plurilingual view puts awareness at the core of the process. And finally, we have what is very important is the empowering process in relation to norms. So because plurilinguals have usually more facility in perceiving these unusual analogies, association, because they go from one language to the other, their trajectory and biography has been shaped through the different components. So they have been called to live, to cope with this diversity. They have this capacity for metaphorical thinking, and again, as I said, important in the creative process. But what is important here is that they get this more flexible attitude towards the norm, opening to hybrid spaces and crossing the boundaries. Why this is so important? Well, because again, we saw that there is this important move from following the norm, language as a myth, language as something that is well codified, etc., which out there, outside of our scholarly discussion, is still seen like that. So you have this, you have to cope with that. But we know that both languages and the language learner change all the time. And languages themselves are complex adaptive systems. And we know that they change, and it's only through the contributions of each single learners and user that language change. So this idea of empowering process in relation to the norms means, in very practical terms, that you are not afraid of experimenting, of trying, of doing things. You're aware of the norm. You're not breaking the norm just for the sake of breaking the norm. You're breaking it in a creative way. As Larsen, Freeman, and Cameron said already in 2008, where systems are stretched, where conventional rules are not upheld, where a point of criticality is reached, new forms emerge. New forms and patterns then become the resources of the community upon which members of the speech community can draw, exploit, and reshape to populate with their own intentions and the affordances of the new context. This can be said at the different scales. Can be said at the language in a big community, like a country, or even more, but it can become also something that is within those social spaces that are so important, that are the classes, the speech community, local speech community, and then we can translate that also to the individual themselves in their own language biography and in their own personal trajectory, because it feeds into these new affordances and into this reshaping of individual repertoire. So in this dynamic perspective, which is necessarily action-oriented, we see that language happens through perception in action, as already Van Leer anticipated, because these learners and social agents, they perceive this invitation to act, and then they are engaged in the process of doing that requires mediation at different levels when they communicate across language and cultures, but across language initial picture. It's not just across language, the sign of Babas, it's also across language varieties. It's registers, it's idiolect. Within and across the social communities, they mediate for themselves in the cognitive process. Also, they mediate in their mind when they talk to themselves, but they can mediate in an ideal dialogue with a fictional character. This was the importance of having new descriptors for literature, because literature was seen as something untouchable, but we know that literature is, to paraphrase Dead Poets Society, what we live for, no? What helps us to live more than engineering and other noble pursuit, as he said. So we needed to capture this aspect. And then, of course, we mediate in online environments and distant communication. And we have seen with the pandemics that this has become crucial. We couldn't do differently. And there have been a lot of creative solutions for that, because in all of that, we engage with our minds, senses, and emotions. So we are at the conclusion of our talk, and I have just 2 slides. Just to wrap up and say that mediation is a lens to a plurilingual vision. And by breaking down, it helps us break down the myth of pureness of languages and cultures, and it opens an entire space. So the mediation that individuals make when they language or plurilanguage open up the possibilities of a new positioning vis-a-vis languages, communication, and our own worldview, which is basically what we are mostly interested in, like the ability of repositioning, not only vis-a-vis languages and communication, which are very important, but the worldview. And finally, this idea that plurilingualism empowers individuals to see possibilities where others see barriers. It's a bit, as I used the metaphor of a prism for mediation, because I said it shows something, makes visible something that is invisible. Well, plurilingualism is the same thing. You see possibilities where others only see barriers, norms, and blocks, but you see a way of coping with that, and you conceptualize the difference differently as the nurturing feature of our increasingly diverse society. And I think that this is absolutely urgent in our society, so it can give a big contribution. And this is my final slides, where I think that we can say that mediation is at the core of knowledge construction, knowledge co-construction, and knowledge reconstruction, because it helps and it has an enormous potential in language education. So on one side, we make learners and teachers with them aware of the complex nature of language and language learning, and of the mediated nature of this complex process. Then we foreground the idea that language learners have repertoires that are plural and dynamic, that are never ending, that are constantly shaping and reshaping and going to different levels of a transitional balance, because that's the beauty. They are constantly evolving. Finally, we have this idea that we empower the learners, because the moment they see that this is normal, not only this is good, this is what it is in languages and language learning, and even in society, they are empowered, they recognize their trajectory and their funds of knowledge, and they don't try and hide them under the carpet or be ashamed, worse, be ashamed of that. And so all in all, it facilitates social integration by broadening the scope of language education. And I thank you very much for the attention. And I used this quote from Antonio Machado that I really like, and it aligns very well with complexity theories, I think. So let me stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Piccardo. I think everybody, we can maybe show appreciation by sending like a big round of virtual applause. Thank you so much for this incredibly insightful presentation. I'm sure that there are many questions that people would like to ask you.